That feeling, it was amazing, she would say later. But no one in the town believed her at first, because no one believed anything good could come from Eli Mercer anymore, not after the way his name had been dragged, through dust and gossip and half-true whispers that clung tighter than burrs to denim, not after the way people crossed the street when his boots sounded against the boardwalk, not after the way the ranch at the edge of Red Hollow became a place mothers warned their sons about and preachers mentioned vaguely in sermons about pride and ruin. Yet on the morning, everything changed. The desert sky was clean and blue, and the air carried the smell of sage and sun-warmed earth, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Because Eli Mercer, the disgraced rancher who'd once been the town's golden boy, rode straight through the main street on his black horse without slowing, had low, shoulders set, eyes forward, and everyone noticed because he hadn't done that in 3 years. Not since the fire, not since the trial, not since he'd been found innocent by law but guilty by rumor. And riding with him, close enough that her knee brushed his saddle, close enough that the whole town saw, was Mara Klein, the schoolteacher with the quiet smile and the spine of steel. The woman who'd arrived 2 winters ago and never quite belonged because she asked questions no one liked and refused to look away when things were ugly. The woman people admired from a distance, but never invited too close. And the sight of her there with Eli was enough to make windows fill and conversations die, because everyone knew Mara Klein was careful, and if she chose him then something was wrong, or something was about to be, and Eli felt it too, felt the weight of eyes, the judgment, the old heat in his chest that used to be anger but had cooled into something harder and steadier, something like resolve, because he wasn't riding to provoke or to beg forgiveness. He was riding to tell the truth, and Mara knew it. She could feel it in the way his body moved with the horse. Controlled but alive, like a storm finally given direction. And she remembered the first time she'd met him. Not as the monster the town whispered about, but as a man standing alone at the edge of a burned foundation, hands blackened with ash, staring at the place where his life had cracked open. And how he'd looked at her not with charm or threat, but with exhaustion so deep it made her chest ache. And that was when she'd realized the town's story didn't fit the man. Not completely, not honestly. And over the months that followed, she'd seen him quietly repair fences that weren't his, deliver calves in the snow for neighbors who pretended not to see him, leave food on porches without ever knocking. And she'd also seen the way people took those things without gratitude, without apology, because it was easier to let one man carry the weight of everyone's fear than to admit they'd been wrong. And when the council announced the auction of his land, the final insult dressed up as legality, Mara had gone to him not as a savior but as a witness, telling him the town planned to erase him, to make his silence permanent. And Eli had listened, jaw tight, eyes dark, and said nothing for a long moment before answering that if the town wanted a show, he'd give them one, but it would be on his terms. And now here they were, riding straight toward the courthouse steps where the mayor and council waited with forced smiles and prepared words, expecting compliance or rage, expecting anything except what happened next. Because Eli dismounted calmly, helped Mara down with a hand that lingered just long enough to steady her, and walked up the steps without raising his voice, without anger, and began to speak, not about the fire, not about the accusations, but about the contracts that had been altered, the signatures that didn't match, the insurance claims quietly redirected, the witnesses pressured into silence, names and dates laid out clean and sharp like tools on a table, and the crowd shifted, murmurs rising, because this wasn't the rant of a bitter man. This was the measured truth of someone who had waited and watched and gathered proof while everyone else assumed he was broken. And Mara stood beside him, feeling something bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition, because she saw then not just what he'd lost, but what he still was. And when the mayor tried to interrupt, Eli simply looked at him and said softly but clearly that the town had taken enough from him, and today he was taking something back. Not land or money, but his name. And when he finished, when the silence fell heavy and stunned, it was Mara who spoke next, her voice steady, telling them she had copies of every document, that they'd already been sent beyond Red Hollow, that the truth was no longer something the town could bury. And the shock rippled outward like thunder, faces paling, people looking at each other instead of at Eli for the first time in years. And in that moment, standing there in the open sun with the whole town exposed, Mara felt it, that feeling she would later struggle to put into words. The rush of standing beside someone who refused to bend, who chose dignity over vengeance, who turned pain into something powerful. And when Eli looked at her then, really looked, there was no triumph in his eyes, only gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. And she knew her life had shifted on its axis. Because courage, real courage, does that. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be seen. It simply stands. And in standing, it changes everything. The silence didn't last long after that, because truth has a way of loosening tongues that have been clenched shut for years. And soon the square was alive with overlapping voices, some defensive, some angry, some shaken, and a few, very few, apologetic, while Eli stood there unmoving, letting the noise wash over him as if he'd already passed through worse storms. And Mara stayed at his side, feeling the strange steadiness of him, the way his presence anchored her, even as the town unraveled, because people were beginning to realize that the story they'd repeated so easily had protected the wrong men. And when the council abruptly adjourned and retreated behind closed doors, it only confirmed what many had feared but never dared to say aloud, that Red Hollow had been quietly rotting beneath its polite surface. And as the crowd thinned, some people avoided Eli's eyes, while others stared openly, reassessing him as if seeing a stranger where a villain had once stood. And an older woman stepped forward, trembling slightly, and whispered that she was sorry, that she'd believed what was easiest instead of what was right. And Eli nodded once, accepting without indulgence or cruelty, because forgiveness was something he carried carefully, like a blade that could cut both ways. And when they finally turned away from the square and walked toward the hitching post together, Mara felt the weight lift from her shoulders in a rush so sudden it almost made her dizzy. And she laughed softly, surprising herself, because the air felt different now, lighter, as if the town itself had exhaled. And Eli glanced at her then, with a faint curve to his mouth, not quite a smile but close, and said he hadn't planned on making history that morning, but he was glad she'd been there. And the simplicity of the word struck her harder than any grand declaration could have, because she understood what it meant for a man like him to say he was glad of someone's presence. And as they rode back out past the last buildings toward the open land where the horizon stretched wide and forgiving, Mara felt the tension drain from her body inch by inch, replaced by an awareness that was warm and electric, a sense of being fully alive in a way she hadn't known she was missing. And she thought of how she'd lived carefully for so long, keeping her heart orderly and her choices sensible, believing that steadiness meant safety, but riding beside Eli with the wind tugging at her hair and the truth finally loose behind them. She realized safety had never been the same as freedom. And when they reached the ranch and dismounted, the burned ground still visible beyond the rebuilt fence, Eli paused, looking out over the land that had nearly been taken from him. And for a moment, the weight of memory pulled his shoulders tight again, and Mara stepped closer without thinking, close enough that he could feel her presence even before she touched his arm. And she told him he didn't have to be strong all the time now, that the fight didn't have to be his alone anymore. And he turned toward her slowly, as if afraid of moving too fast and breaking something fragile. And in his eyes she saw not desperation or need, but a careful hope, the kind that had been bruised but not destroyed. And when he reached for her hand, it was tentative, asking rather than taking, and the simple contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with scandal or rebellion and everything to do with recognition, because she felt seen in a way that startled her, felt understood without having to explain herself. And later, much later, when the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold and shadow, when they sat on the porch steps sharing quiet, and the distant sounds of cattle settling for the night, Mara would try to explain it to herself, try to name what had changed. But all she could come back to was that feeling, the one that bloomed when courage met honesty, when two people chose truth even knowing the cost, and when the town eventually spoke again, when whispers turned into stories, retold with different endings, and Eli Mercer's name began to be spoken with respect instead of suspicion. It wouldn't be the victory or the redemption that stayed with her most. It would be that moment of standing beside him when everything was exposed, when fear loosened its grip, and when she realized that sometimes the most amazing feeling isn't being protected or admired, but being brave together in the open light, letting the world see exactly who you are and refusing, at last, to look away if you like. This story, please subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.